تسمعيني؟ نعم. تمام. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lina Al-Hathloul. I'm the head of monitoring and advocacy at ALQST organization. First of all, I would like to offer my deep condolences for the victims in Palestine and especially in Gaza. I stand with solidarity. Today's session is about church struggles in the Gulf and countering the whitewashing strategies. And to discuss this topic, I have three speakers with me. First, from Bahrain, Mr. Jawad Fayrouz, the Director of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. Welcome. And also from Oman, the writer Nabhan Al-Hanashi, who is the Director of Omani Center for Human Rights. Thank you for being among us. And online, we have Mrs. Ibtisam Al-Sayegh, who is a human rights defender and who works also at Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. She was famous for unveiling the violations of human rights in Bahrain. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. First of all, the human rights situation in the Gulf is one of the main challenges for the activists and the civil society, especially that any activity related to the rights usually is resulting in detention and imprisonment and legal prosecution for activists. We shall highlight most challenges, especially with the women, challenges with Mrs. Sam and the ecosystem challenges and the legal status challenges in the Gulf states. First of all, we're going to talk about the women's rights in Gulf. Mrs. Sam, are you with us?
Yes. تقدرون تسمعوني?
A lot of Gulf states have verified and signed CEDAW, which is an agreement about the women's rights. So our first question for you, Mrs. Ibtisam, would be, is this signing for this agreement, does it reflect any progress in the women's rights in the Gulf states, and what are the most important challenges and obstacles faced by women in the Gulf states today? You have the platform.
تسمعوني؟ تسمعوني؟
نعم نسمعك.
تمام. أولاً السلام عليكم، يسعد مساكم جميعاً.
Good evening everyone.
كل تضامن مع ما يحدث في فلسطين وحقهم في التحرر من الاحتلال وأطالب
and against the occupation. I'm hearing my voice.
تكلمي.
سنتحدث عن حقوق المرأة لاحقا وسأبدأ معك أستاذ جواد بخصوص النشاط الحقوقي بخصوص المناخ. أعتقد أنت يوم كنت تشتغل بالمعنويات بالبرلمان كانت ضمن لجنة تشتغل بخصوص المناخ إلى آخره. السؤال الأهم الآن عندنا في الخليج صوت المجتمع المدني. كيف الآن مثلا الإمارات عندنا الكوب 38 الإمارات استضافت كوب 38 لكن هل هذه المؤتمرات استعراضية أو للمجتمع المدني حق الصوت في بلادنا للضغط على تغيير في القوانين؟
Thank you so much for hosting us, and I thank you all for hosting this conference, and I thank ALQST for providing this opportunity to highlight the environment, the climate, and the Gulf states, and to evaluate whether there is a serious action for the liability of the Gulf states to care for the climate and the ecosystem, especially within the climate conference, which is going on in Abu Dhabi. First of all, I was head of the public facilities at the parliament for 2 parliamentary elections, and among its tasks is to take care of the climate and the ecosystem issues. And within the framework of the political strategies in the Gulf or policies, we find that the ecosystems or the climate situation is among its least priorities, and they have no important whatsoever legislations to take care of such situation. We have a lot of examples, and as you know, the Gulf states, they have a lot of development projects, but at the same time, and since the Gulf states, they are wealthy with a lot of natural wealth like the oil, petroleum, the maritime life, or the wells, and a lot of green spaces, including date trees. However, and unfortunately, the first standard in giving any priority to any program in the Gulf states, we find that the environmental issues are the least to be designated. For example, in Bahrain, we have the Vision 2030, which was issued in 2008, in which the ruler have launched it, in which they take into consideration sustainable goals. And also Mohammed bin Salman, who has launched the 2030 vision, who said to have taken into consideration the sustainable goals. However, practically, there is absence of any local legislation to protect the environmental issues, the climate issues, to have proven to be successful, in which we have practiced for years our efforts to provide such legislations. We have provided drafts of legislations, and we have discussed several environmental issues, the maritime life, the lands which are buried with water, the industrial zones, the ozone, the emission of gases, which affect also the residential areas, and also how to preserve the RT wells. We have discussed such projects and discussed that with the concerned ministries, the municipalities, with civil societies. In Bahrain, we have the Association of Environmental Protection. We have a lot of environmental activists, but the lack of any interest by the government in funding such legislation. It was admitted in the parliament, but it wasn't gone further in the Shura Council. And we don't have any investing fundings for such. So this was a very clear index that the environmental issues aren't a priority. And the second point, we have an area in Bahrain, which is Tublik, which is a source for shrimp. and we have the trees of ALQST. Unfortunately, this bay have been reduced in size because of the many residential buildings being built on it. And there is also a water pathway which is being used for sanitary outlets. And we were surprised to have found that they were owned by some private directions or entities in Bahrain. So there is a quick building for such residential buildings and such bays without taking into consideration any environmental aspects. Also, Bahrain claims, or even all different Gulf states, that they hold the environmental issues as priorities, but this is totally contradicting with the reality. They only care about like hosting international events, sports events like Formula One, or also the last conference for the parliamentary unions was in Bahrain. The political system or a regime has been turned into a royal regime. That's why I think that any kind of events, whether for sports or any other events, are being hosted not for the sake of enforcing such, but for the sake of only whitewashing their image. Thank you, Mr. Jawad, for all of this information. Do you have any comments? I would probably add to what's related to Oman, because whoever has checked the international reports in Oman, they find that they have been complemented a lot due to the efforts in the maritime and the land lives. But in the last 17 years, it have suffered from natural disasters, tornadoes in 2007, and the last one, and which was Shaheen, which have a lot of destruction. Also, we have the salt of the artesian water, or the underground water. Because they are coastal areas and at the same time agricultural areas, and this would affect other wells, especially in the agriculture sectors. Also, we have the pollution of the water because of the oil and the petroleum. We have a lot of environmental issues and problems, and we can see that due to the climate change which is going on in Oman, and we don't know the actual reasons behind them. There's also an association in Oman, which is a governmental one, and the civil society, unfortunately, isn't permitted to act liberally. And that because they are always monitored. So when we have a water pollution or a sea pollution, or when we have any kind of storms or underground salt water, this means that the precautionary measures weren't executed in order to avoid any of these risks which affect the environment. I would like also to comment, which actually a point which was highlighted in 2011 during the strikes which took the streets, which is Ghadafan. And I think my colleague Khalfan would comment later on it, which means petroleum plants or which were very close to the residential areas, which had a result of it a lot of cancer cases, and the authorities tried to cover this truth. Even it prevented the hospitals in Oman in writing reports, medical reports about that. Also the private centers, private medical centers. So some of them had to go to the United Arab Emirates there to get the treatment in order to get the reports, medical reports there. Due to having cancer due to these plants there. So there's no enough liberty and moving there and to highlighting what's really going on within this situation. Thank you so much. It was very clear. I think that the monitoring is an issue in all Gulf states. The health climate for human rights, I don't think it's healthy at all in the Gulf states. Ms. Ibtisam, can you hear me?
هل تسمعينني؟ تسمعوني؟ مرحبا مرحبا. تسمعوني؟ الآن تسمعوني؟
The international agreement on counterfighting all discrimination against women. First of all, in Bahrain and generally in the Gulf states, did this verification result in any progress in the women rights in the Gulf states, and what are the challenges and obstacles faced by women in Bahrain and in the Gulf states today?
هل تسمعونني؟
يلا بس دقيقة.
اوكي، يعني الصوت واضح. انا شغلت اللابتوب وشغلت الجهاز التليفون.
هل يمكنها أن تتحدث؟ عبد الله، هل يمكنها أن تتحدث؟
هل تسمعونني؟
So, for example, in Bahrain, the UAE, there's a kind of enforcing or enabling of women. There is a true effort to have women being candidates in some of the sectors. In Bahrain, the women have the right as the man to vote. However, let us actually view this enable or enforcement of women. Is it really because they believe in the women or in their equal rights? Or is it just in response for some of the pressures practiced? For example, most of the Gulf regimes provide different kind of aids in order and condition as a condition for them as the enablement or enforcement of women. And most of the times it's not actually because they believe in the women's rights. The second factor is when we speak about the different rights, they are actually restricted, they are actually limited. The women in the Gulf states in general, they don't have the right to give the nationality for their children. This is actually a very unjust and arbitrary decision. Although there is in legislation an improvement in the rights of the women compared to the rights of men, but why do we still have such an unjust decision, and also in the appointment of women in some of the posts and choosing of women in some of jobs? I personally think and evaluate that the elected commissions and others, they're just as an ineffective image for women. For example, in Bahrain, the National Council in Bahrain has no women. The judiciary system has no women. If we go to different sectors which hold the strategic decisions, we find there is an absence for women. Even the councils which were founded to defend women's rights, we find that the king is the head of such council. So this is all among the strategy of the state. So in general, there is a great difference between the past 3 decades and the situation of the women today. As for the national struggle of women are still struggling in Bahrain because most of the public events held, whether the memberships of the civil society, the peaceful stings, the media, the number of women were far more than the number of men. So, to sum it up, what we have in the public institutions to empower women isn't fair yet and isn't equal yet to women and doesn't really represent the authority vision. Thank you so much. So I would like also to highlight the 2 points, the one of nationality in Oman and the violations against women in Oman. After 18 years of signing the agreement for women, after 18 years, we are still in the same level or the same phase, and we didn't provide any progress in this aspect. And as for the agreement related to counterfight any discrimination against women, what we can see that really reflecting in reality. Neither protecting the women through the laws. The discrimination is still practiced until now. So Oman also doesn't allow the women to pass their nationalities to their children. Or if they do, they give you that with very tough terms. So the woman is better to claim that she doesn't know who the dad is, or to say the truth that she is married to this man. This is an actual issue, and this is stated in the text of the law that the nationality uh, is being passed to the children of an Omani woman but an unknown dad. But if the dad is a foreigner, then the children aren't eligible to have the nationality only after several years, maybe. And also the other law, if her husband has left her for 10 years or so, then she has the right to demand the nationality to be passed for her son or daughter, but they should be minors. So these are very complicated laws to be applied by the women, especially those married to foreigners. This is as for the nationality. But when we speak about domestic violence, and unfortunately, there are a lot of women, girls who were murdered by the partners, by their family members. And despite our demands to provide a hotline and actual protection means for women, but the government is being stubborn in this and is refusing that and didn't provide neither of our demands. And the social affairs minister is actually against it, and in one of its statements in 2021, if I recall well. So she said that it's left for the family members to decide. And this is very bizarre to have such an attitude by an educated woman, because this is an issue which is related directly to women, and she is a woman. And unfortunately, even in murder cases of women, the government up till now didn't do any actual action to improve this situation. This is my comment to this. Thank you for the points that you have highlighted, and especially the women who are in very important posts. When I chose this, there was a lady who was detained in Saudi Arabia who was subject to torture, electric torture, and she was prevented from any visits. The only delegation that they have allowed to visit her is the Human Rights Commission in Saudi Arabia. Among the delegation, there were women. One of them was Amal Mani. They have visited my sister Lujain in the prison, and they have checked torture signs. And Lujain has told them everything that happened to her. And after the delegation left the prison, they have denied that she's been subject to torture. And the only woman who is an ambassador in Saudi Arabia told me that we were using the human rights for women for political goals, and this is unfortunately, of course, I'm mentioning that. Fozela Taibi would be with us in the last session. Her sister is also detained, and the only charges against her that she wasn't wearing a whole abaya. So we think that the Saudi government, Bahrain, Omani government, they exploit the women in such posts. The political goals, the only purposes of appointing them in such posts is for tourism. But the Saudi women doesn't have the actual freedom, they pretend. We don't have any shelters for those subject to any violence. Aziz Al Yusuf and other Saudi activists, they were founding an institute to protect the women subject to violence, but the government has totally refused that. Unfortunately, Abtisam doesn't have the chance to speak about the women situation in Bahrain and how they're being dealt with. They're being she's a victim of violence, a victim of sexual harassment. And sexual harassment probably is an underestimated term for what Najah Youssef has been through. And there is a documentary in BBC which is translated in both Arabic and English, and they talk in details in what they have been subject to when they were detained in 2010 in the investigation rooms of the national security. And here we can check for real the reality of these regimes and how they treat women, how they look at the women's rights. The most horrific violence they subject the women to, the sexual harassment being subject to, and we didn't find that these institutions which were claimed to be founded to defend women's rights, as the Higher Council for Women, they have never issued any statement in this concern up to this day, despite that Abtisam is still standing up tall and she's strong, and despite her demands to hold accountable a lot of international committees and commissions have asked to hold accountable who were a part of this. And while we are evaluating the core of any regime, especially with what has to do with empowerment of women, how they actually deal with women in such cases, and unfortunately, as in slang, neither the Arabic morals or the Islamic Sharia and far away, and none of the human rights aspects were taken into consideration. This is very shameful, and it can be treated only by unveiling the truth and holding accountable those concerned, and also having an actual commitment by everyone concerned, and holding accountable anyone who were part of this. So if anyone is detained, as also I was subject to the first threat, they would tell me that we would bring also your other family members to the prison. We would take away their nationalities. We would subject them to harassment. And this happened in more than one Gulf state. Thank you. Can we try again with some, probably for the last time?
من هذا الجهاز تسمعوني؟ تسمعوني الآن؟ ما في فرصة. هل بالإمكان الآن تسمعون؟ في صوت الآن؟ أوكي؟ فيني أتكلم الآن؟ طيب، سأتكلم عن المرأة البحرينية والخليجية عامة. أين الدعم من واقعها؟ سؤال أكيد يتبادر للمتابعين مع انتشار العناوين البراقة والصور لدعم المرأة.
Okay.
ومكانتها التي
And her status, which anyone who would check that the women in the Gulf states have been in a top place, at the top.
بسبب هذا الحضور وحصلت على كافة.
And they would think that the woman have gained all of her rights and all of her family members' rights. However, the reality is contrary to that. Despite everything that's been said or published, the Bahraini woman today, with her children, are being deprived of the right to the nationality. Despite that, there is a huge institution, which is the Higher Council for Women, which was issued since 2001, so it's like 21 years old. But it didn't achieve any victory for the women. which enables her to provide the nationality to her children if she was married to a foreigner. Also, it ignores the children of the Bahraini woman even who gave birth after the nationality was taken away from her husband. Up to this date, the woman cannot issue the first passport, neither to receive it in case the husband was absent. This is the reality. And she has to prove her custody to be able to do a limited or restricted delegation for managing her kids' affairs. Of course, this requires a huge effort on her behalf, and most probably the pressure would be exercised by the father of her father of the children, the grandfather, which means, who would replace the father and which annuls her role as a mother and also marginalizes her as a woman. This higher council was supposed to be a shelter for the woman, an asylum for women in case she was subject to any kind of discrimination. But it only condemned shyly the domestic violence it's being subject to, and ignored the violence subject by the authorities. Tens of women are actually victims of direct violence. Nurses, doctors, teachers, all kinds of specializations. They had an opposing voice. And that's why they were subject to violence and to being silenced. And some of them had actually passed away without having justice prevailing. Unfortunately, the policy of not being held accountable is the one which is prevailing, and the voice of the justice is absent. Unfortunately, I'm one of the victims who had testified that we were subject to violence, to sexual harassment, to torture by the authorities. But the Higher Council of Women didn't actually condemn all of what we were subject to, and our testimonies were actually neglected by them. A lot of organizations in the international community have actually adopted our voices. However, no one inside our country have adopted our voices. Unfortunately, this higher council was actually playing a very negative role. Unfortunately, they would send their representatives around the world in order to represent the Bahraini woman, but they don't actually represent the women of Bahrain, although they claim that they do. Unfortunately, having the woman in higher posts, especially in civil society posts, is only an image. Despite that, the Bahraini women have gone through a lot of struggle to reach such posts, but all of her struggles were actually restricted by these associations and committees. This also applies to the cases of the children. We don't find any association, any committee which actually speaks loud about the violations which these children who are under 18, the minors, are being subject to. In which all of the victims or all the beneficiaries from these associations or NGOs have found them to only provide them with services but don't do an actual change for what they have been through. Also, the existence of women in the parliament didn't do any actual change for the situation of women in the country. Despite that they are in very important posts which they can exploit in the favor of the women, but we didn't see any progress in this aspect. Just imagine with me that just being a woman who is a wife of a prisoner, she's being deprived with her children from any kind of support from the government for the living costs or anything else. They are being deprived from every single living support for the living costs, despite and ignoring the amount of struggle that they're leaving such families in. The Bahraini woman is actually restricted in many aspects, despite being in very important posts, despite being an activist or an attorney, and despite what the constitution of Bahrain actually guarantees from the space of freedom. She's being persecuted, she's being silenced in order to keep her silence from speaking the truth. And using the women rights file is only to whitewash the image of the authorities and to add a civilized image of such authorities. These authorities themselves preview women who are in such important posts in the political arena that it's a prohibited arena for women. And she is being subject to all kinds of verbal harassment, condemnation, and humiliation. Of course, we in Bahrain and in the Gulf states, we need a tangible change in reality. Which actually echoes in our real lives. It's not just statements which roam around in the media and which does no change in the reality. So we ask you to stop exploiting the women rights issues for fake stuff only to pertain your own image. Unfortunately, this doesn't reflect in reality. Unfortunately, the only reality we have is implementing sanctions against us and being persecuted and the tough living situation. So it's enough or it's sufficient to be a Bahraini activist to be prohibited from entering the Saudi territories and to be even treated or dealt with as one of the criminals. This is an actual reality that we are encountering nowadays. However, and despite everything, we will keep struggling in order to make actual changes and in order to have the justice prevail for the future generations. Women are actually beautiful and they have to be present in every single sector or aspect in life, but we want her to be present for true and effectively. Thank you so much.
أكثر من محفل لتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار الدائمين في أي منطقة في أي دولة. يجب أن نضمن 3 أمور أساسية. الأمر الأول، يجب للدولة أن تكون حاضرة ولديها رؤية صادقة لتحقيق 3 أمور أساسية. الأمر الأول، الدولة بأنها تتبنى مشروعا إصلاحيا شاملا في إطار الحقوقي وفي إطار السياسي. هذا لازم يكون ديمومة، لازم يكون مستمر في هذا الأمر. وجوهر هذا الموضوع موضوع المشاركة الشعبية. جوهر الموضوع موضوع إن الشعب يكون له سلطة، يكون له دور، يكون إذا لم يتحول إلى برامج عمل في إطار التنمية المستدامة سوف لن يؤدي إلى المرتجى في هذا الموضوع. الأمر الثالث الأساسي، كل هذه الأمور لازم تكون مبنية على قضايا حقوق الإنسان. في غياب وجود معيار حقوق الإنسان في أي مشروع سياسي، في غياب وجود قضايا حقوق الإنسان في مشروع تنموي، مثلا مشروع تنموي لا يراعي حقوق البيئة أو لا يراعي حقوق المرأة أو لا يراعي حقوق المواطنة في إطار مشورة حتى في إطار المجمعات السكنية أو بناء العمراني وشابه ذلك، أنا في رأيي بأن هذه المشاريع غير مستدامة ويؤدي إلى عدم الاستقرار ويؤدي إلى عدم الأمن. لماذا؟ لأن تكون هناك هزات شعبية لأنها غير مبنية على هذه الأصول.
العهد الدولي للحقوق الاقتصاديه والثقافيه والاجتماعيه، بالاضافه طبعا الى الاخفاء القسري، بالاضافه اتفاقيات عديده. طبعا هل تم ايماج بنود او فقرات هذه الاتفاقيات في القوانين المحليه والدساتير الوطنيه؟ للاسف هذا لم يحدث. واحنا لدينا خبره طويله في التعامل للاسف من الحكومه العمانيه او السلطات العمانيه لانها مهتمه بالسمعه الخارجيه اكثر للاسف من حقوق في الداخل. هل احنا ضد هل احنا في سبيل عرقله التنميه وعرقله؟ لا، هذا كلام طبعا فاضي للاسف ويعتد به، لانك انت في الاخير لما تصوب المشكله على الخطا لا يعني انك انت المخطئ، المشكله في وجود الخطا، مش المشكله في فتح الخطا على سبيل المثال. هذه نقطه. النقطه الاخرى، بعد سنوات عديده من محاوله ومطالبه الاصلاح وإدخال عملية إصلاحية على الدساتير الوطنية والقوانين وتفعيل ما يمكن أن يخدم حقوق الإنسان بحيث أنه يعطي مناخ صحي أفضل، للأسف هذا لم يتحقق الآن. أنا شخصيا كشخص يعني لو جيت وفصلت مثلا العمل المؤسسي عن رأيي الشخصي، أنا وصلت إلى قناعة أنه مسألة تغيير النظام هذا أمر لا بد منه، يعني بالنسبة لي كقناعة شخصية، لأنه أنت للأسف أنت جالس تستخدم نفس الأساليب او اساليب مختلفه حتى خلينا نقول، وفي الاخير تصل الى نفس المسدود، لانه السلطه الحاكمه للاسف لا تريد اي اصلاح الذي يتيح للناس او يتيح الى وجود واقع حقوقي ومناخ صحي ممكن ممارسته.
حابه تعرفين السؤال كان هلا يعني نتهمنا بالعاده ان يعني داتا خارجية.
فعلا هو أنا لما رجعت السجارة حسيت إنهم مهملين حقوق الإنسان جدا، يعني حتى أكثر من قبل لا يطرحون مشاريع تنموية أو رغبتهم في إنهم يتقدمون مع العالم. أنا أعتقد يمكن أو من المحال إنهم يكونون في مصلحة الدول المتقدمة والإنسان هناك ما له قيمة، المرأة حتى ما لها قيمة. أنا أعتقد حتى زاد وضعها سوءا. فيعني أكثر شيء أنا مهتمة فيه إنه ما راح تصير تنمية أبداً بدون ما يشركونا كمواطنين وكنساء في هذه التنمية. الفرد هو يعني العامل الرئيسي في التنمية، بدونها ما تقدر.
شكرا فوز. شكرا لكم جميعا، وانتهينا بالجلسة الثانية. وراكم بعد 10 دقائق.
شكرا.
Welcome again to today's first session of the conference, and my sincere apologies again for all the technical issues. This session will be held in English, and we will try and provide Arabic transcripts of the session later on. So I hope everyone in the room is able to follow us. Otherwise, maybe some colleagues can translate key messages afterwards. In this session, we want to speak about Saudi Arabia's public investment fund and its different investments both inside and outside Saudi Arabia. The Sovereign Wealth Fund is amongst the largest in the world, with a total estimated of over $700 billion. We will be addressing some of the projects that are sponsored by the fund within Saudi Arabia, specifically the NEOM Megacity project, but also the investment the fund is doing, especially in sports, to attract sports events to Saudi Arabia or invest into those sports clubs abroad. With me, I have two speakers in the room. That is Celia Lenoy, she's a ALQST project officer, and James Lynch, co-founder and director of the partner organization Fair Square. Online, I have with me Abdallah Oda, Saudi activist and Saudi director at the Freedom Initiative, and John Hurd, who is the founder of the Newcastle Fans Against Sports Washing. And I would like to start by handing the floor or giving the word to Celia. As many of you might remember, we did work on a report that we published in February this year on human rights violations that we were able to document in the context of the construction of megacity NEOM, especially the forced displacement of members of the Al-Huwaita tribe and their persecution. And we're currently actually working on sort of a follow-up report or a shorter briefing that looked at various human rights violations involved or connected to this project, but also really tries to look at it from various different angles and ask the question of why it is problematic. Because ALQST is also having a lot of engagement with businesses. I mean, I think, yeah, we're doing sort of the political advocacy, and I think many of the topics we've discussed earlier regarding UN work and sort of leverage one can have with political stakeholders. We're also trying to engage with business stakeholders because obviously they hold a lot of power as well. And yeah, so this next briefing aims at business stakeholders and what they should consider when considering investing in NEOM. And yeah, saying that, I'll hand over to Celia to give an overview of that research that she's been working on. So please, Celia.
Thank you, Julia. I'm just going to start with a very brief overview of what NEOM actually is. So it's this megacity project. It's part of the Vision 2030 plan for Saudi Arabia. It has a budget of $500 billion and it's partially funded by the PIBS, the Public Investment Fund. It promises to be this very innovative project that sets the example for future environmental policies. However, as Julia mentioned, it's full of issues and very problematic. And considering the priority that the authorities give to this project, we have deemed essential to fact check the official narrative around NEOM. So I'm just going to leave aside for now the considerations of the design of NEOM and projects such as Georgina and the Line, and the inconsistencies in designing NEOM to directly turn to human rights. So the first aspect that I would like to mention regarding human rights in NEOM is the digital surveillance that is planned to be implemented in NEOM and more specifically the data mining that is proposed by NEOM is problematic for at least two reasons. The first one is that there should be a lack of free and informed consent consent because of there's sheer lack of transparency regarding what will happen to your data, what happens if you don't agree to the data mining, also the adding a financial incentive completely distorts consent. And really, the second aspect that is problematic for the data mining in NEOM is the possible use by the authorities of the main of repression. So relinquishing one's fundamental right to privacy, which is enshrined in the UDHR and the ACCPR, is extremely dangerous in a country like Saudi Arabia, where repression extends even to the online sphere. As was mentioned in the first session, in July this year, for instance, we had the first sentencing to death of Mohammed al-Hamdi, of a person for peaceful media activism. But not only can we foresee the potential human rights abuses linked to NEOM, we can also document them on the ground already. As Julia mentioned, our NEOM report published in February this year documents the forced eviction and displacement of members of the Huaytay tribe with arbitrary arrests and detentions followed by unfair trials. So far, at least 48 members of the Huaytay tribe have been detained, 15 sentenced to lengthy prison terms of 15 years, and at least 5 have been sentenced to death. And also, there's also a really important issue considering who is building NEOM. So the migrant workers in Saudi Arabia's construction industry, which essentially the migrant workers make up about 80% of the labour force in the private sector in Saudi Arabia. So the construction of NEOM and other megacity projects once Vision 2030 would overwhelmingly rely on their labour. And why it's problematic? It's problematic because they're exploited through the kafala system, which ties their employment and immigration status to their sponsor. And there are also widespread systematic abuses such as passport confiscation and deceptive recruitment practices, which make migrant workers extremely vulnerable to forced labour. So NEOM is widely detrimental to human rights, but it's also detrimental to the environment, contrary to what some people would have us believe. And let it be reminded that as of last year, the UN has recognized the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment as a human right. And NEOM has an adverse environmental impact in at least 2 ways. The first one is its impact on the ecosystem. To name only a few issues, we have, for instance, the land that's problematic for migration routes and bird collision. And we also have the island project of Sindela, which is problematic for the marine flora and fauna because it promises to be a yachting hub. Then it's also problematic, NEOM is also problematic as it is a very energy-intensive venture, not only for the construction, because the construction of a megacity in the desert obviously requires enormous amounts of materials, but also for the maintenance of NEOM. I'm thinking in that regard, for instance, to take an example, after Jeddah and its year-round ski destination, which would rely heavily on artificial snow, which is energy intensive in terms of electricity, but as well water as well. So NEOM not really considered to be a viable solution for the environment and an answer to current climate change challenges. And that's really telling about how the Saudi authorities use NEOM to greenwash their environmental impact. When they said that they're determined to drill the last drop of oil and it's to developing countries in Africa and Asia, and they consistently downplay climate change and hinder climate negotiations, as we can see in this COP, but also in COP26. So NEOM appears to be little more than a vanity project, greenwashing Saudi Arabia's environmental impact, built by exploited migrant workers on the land of the evicted Huaytay tribe, and presenting serious concerns about the right to privacy and freedom of expression.
Thank you very much, Celia. And yeah, I think James will probably later on be able to add a few comments on that as well. And yeah, so we've heard it's a little bit of a vanity project, and I think just to add one and moving on to the investments of the PIV abroad is also really the fact that well, when we get contacted, when we speak, for example, to architectural firms that consider involvement in NEOM, some of them, you know, they come in and they know contact and they want to do really impactful, important work in Saudi Arabia. And I think that raises another element or question that we'll also be looking into as everything is what are the actual needs of the people in Saudi Arabia? Aren't there other sort of infrastructural needs or needs when it comes to the health system or others that could or should be addressed first? But without going much into detail, I think I would like to hand it over to our first online speaker, John Hurt, who can maybe tell us a little bit about how his group, was established, and how you work, how you operate, and what impact the Saudi Public Investment Fund in Newcastle United had on the people in your city. Curious.
One moment, I'm just setting the timer. Okay, well, just a word on the PIF to start with. Over 2 years ago, when the Saudi chief dictator, Mohammed bin Salman, made Boris Johnson an offer he couldn't refuse, Boris Johnson secretly, and it's now come out, pressurized the Premier League to allow the deal to go through. At that time, 2 years ago, the press in the northeast of England and a lot of people who thought they could benefit from the Saudi ownership said that the PIF was separate from the Saudi state. 2 years down the line, nobody argues that anymore. So I won't waste any time talking about that. I'll talk more about the consequences of Saudi dictatorship ownership of our football club. It's important to realise that Newcastle is a northeast city with fine traditions in mining, shipbuilding, and engineering. Strong working class traditions of unity, solidarity, and human rights. And it's important to remember that as I'm speaking, because that culture, that tradition, despite the Saudi dictatorship spending £500 million on Newcastle United, in fact, no one asked the Saudi people if they wanted that amount of money spent on a team for personal prestige and for sports washing purposes. That money is being used to distract attention away from their many crimes. The majority of people in Newcastle still, if you ask them, would say they support democracy and human rights. And I would underline, however, the regime's sports washing project on Tyneside has the potential to erode local democracy and support for basic human rights worldwide. So we've been warned about that. So prior to the dictatorship taking over the club, most fans, councillors, MPs said they would keep talking about human rights. Unfortunately, this has not happened. As a campaign, we have raised the cases of the Saudi miners on death row at protests outside the stadium and have been respected by fans. We haven't been attacked or abused. However, elected representatives have failed to speak up. This is a worrying development which must be addressed head on. And the question I'm putting on the table, we often discuss, is how can we change this situation? Amongst the media and political class and a layer of fans in the club, there's developed what I would like to characterize as a worshipping of the accomplished fact of the club being owned by a bloody dictatorship. However, the more we campaign, the more we find fans who are unhappy with the situation. Hardly any Newcastle fans who you meet support what the regime is doing in Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, they aren't sure what we can do to oppose them, or they haven't been too sure. It's our job with people like yourselves in the room to show them a way. I would underline that the importance of grassroots campaigning to effect change, that's been our experience at Newcastle. That's what's been shown to us. Now, one of your speakers, from your campaign, Lena, was invited by us to visit Newcastle last September because we felt that fans and the people of Tyneside needed to hear the voice of Saudi human rights defenders, after listening to 2 years of regime propaganda, because that's what the situation has been in Newcastle. Now, I have to say that Lena's visit, if you don't know, if you haven't read about this, Lena's visit to Newcastle had an electrifying effect. Journalists actually were genuinely shocked and affected by Lena's testimony. The visit showed that Newcastle fans are willing to listen to the voices of the victims, of the owners of Newcastle United. At the time of Lena's visit, the Saudi regime had organised 2 internationals for the Saudi Falcons at St James's Park, which is the stadium where Newcastle play. We managed to get Newcastle City Council to issue a statement supporting human rights in Saudi Arabia. If we hadn't have said anything, they wouldn't have said anything, and they did, because we pointed out that the land on which the stadium is built is owned by the council, and they had a responsibility to say something about a foreign state, a dictatorship, holding 2 internationals for propaganda purposes at our stadium. So actually the 2 Saudi internationals at St James's Park actually failed as a propaganda tool for the regime. They expected a lot more fans to turn up. Most Newcastle fans didn't turn up to that game. In effect, it was a political and sporting flop, and it indicates that there is a limit to how much the Saudi regime can use the regime and Newcastle United for propaganda purposes. We also managed to make some progress on getting elected representatives to make a stand in favour of human rights in Saudi Arabia, a small minority. Some Newcastle councillors did speak to Lena on a visit and offered limited support. Now, I think as a football fan and supporter of human rights, I think it's my responsibility today to mention what I've heard mentioned in other sessions is the disgraceful effort of FIFA, well, basically a corrupt effort by FIFA to award the 2034 World Cup to the Saudi dictatorship. Today, the Saudi sports minister, Abdul Aziz bin Turki Al Faisal, in an interview with the BBC said sports washing against the country are very shallow and insisted everyone is welcome. Now, where have we heard that before? Prior to 2022 in Qatar. In our opinion, this interview by the Saudi sports minister shows how sensitive the regime is to criticism. That's why we're expanding our campaign to the rest of Europe. In our campaigning work, in 2 years, we've learned a lot. We've been contacted by fans all over Britain, but also around Europe. We've fans from Holland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, France, amongst others. We've discussed with activists from the Cancel Qatar 2022 campaign, who will be speaking at our launch meeting next Thursday. Now, prior to the Qatar World Cup, well-known figures like David Beckham were paid an absolute fortune to help sports watch the image of the Qatari regime. The FIFA and Qatari regime's narrative was that human rights would be respected and even improved. Did that happen? We know the answer. It's estimated that over 6,500 Indian, Pakistani, Nepali, Bangladeshi, and Sri Lankan construction workers died to build the stadiums that made the World Cup possible in Qatar. Now, given the horrendous treatment of the Huwaitite tribe, which has already been mentioned in the initial stages in building of Neom, the mega city, does anyone really think that the conditions of workers and respect for their human rights will improve to build the stadiums for the possible World Cup in 2034 if the royal dictatorship stays in power? We have a mission statement, which we'll be discussing next Thursday, and everyone's invited to come along. There's 5 points, but there's 3 of them which I think are pertinent to this discussion. I'm not proposing a debate, but I'm just putting it out there. This is what groups of football fans are talking about now regarding a possible World Cup in Saudi Arabia in 2034. Point 1 is that we're campaigning to get legislation in Europe on ownership of football clubs before 2034. Nation states cannot be allowed to own our football clubs. Companies have to apply the historic and democratic values of the game, and fans must be involved in ownership. Point 3, which is very pertinent to this discussion today, opposition to the proposed World Cup in Saudi Arabia. Human rights abusing dictatorships cannot be allowed to use the beautiful game to sports wash away their crimes. And finally, number 4, appeal to football associations, legislators, players and fans in Europe to boycott the 2034 World Cup, and if it goes ahead, to organise an alternative Human Rights World Cup. Now, we're putting that on the table now because we think, from the experience of the campaign against the Qatar World Cup and all that we saw happened and that wasn't achieved regards human rights, that we think it's best to get this discussion out in the open as early as possible. Now, the final point I wanted to make was about, what Julia asked about, our campaigning and what are we, I'm not going to give a whole history of what we've done, but also about where we are now and where we want to go next. I think what we want to do is to build on the success of Lena's visit, and we want to take the campaign to groups who can influence political representatives. We see a situation where basically the local press, the media, and the local politicians have basically been silenced. What a price! $500 million not to say anything about human rights. So we have to get around that roadblock. And so we have already prepared, and we're sending out letters to women's groups, specifically about the case of Salma al-Shabaab, to student unions and youth groups in Newcastle, appealing for solidarity with the young men on death row, the minors on death row. We also have a letter for teacher and university unions highlighting the case of Mohammed bin Nasser al-Ghamdi, who everybody knows what's happened to him. We're also seeking support for the call to change the name of a street near St James's Park, Newcastle's stadium, to either Hamal Khashoggi or Human Rights Street. And I think a very, very important thing, this is the final point, a very important thing that we're proposing is that Newcastle groups like that, women's groups, youth groups, students' unions, and hopefully political representatives would support and participate in a human rights sports washing forum in Newcastle in 2034. We think it's vital that human rights groups like yourselves and others take your human rights advocacy to the place where the regime are degrading local democracy through their ownership of the club. We think a human rights conference on sports washing in Newcastle would have a massive effect, just like Lena's visit. To be honest, we've had enough of listening to the propaganda of the Saudi state in the northeast, Tyneside and Newcastle through the megaphone of the local press. It's time to hear the voices of Saudi people who are suffering under the oppression of the 80% owners of our club. We're just ordinary football fans. And so we think that the modest progress of our group shows what can be achieved, and hopefully, is an inspiration to other groups who want to achieve something. In the end, it's a battle for hearts and minds. And although we don't have the $500 million that the Saudi regime has spent on our club, we know that what we're saying and our cause is just. And we think that we can actually make even further progress in the future with your collaboration and help.
Thank you very much, also for helping to mobilize sort of new audiences and football fans to support the human rights movement in Saudi Arabia. This is really powerful. And for raising, once again, I think that other sessions have touched upon it already. World Cup, the World Cup bid or award, possibly to Saudi Arabia in 2034. I'm not sure our session will have a lot of capacity or will have a lot of time to really cover that fully. But in terms of sports washing, of course, we need to look at the organizers or facilitators of such events, engage with them on human rights concerns, potentially condition engagement of these organizers, also participants, on certain human rights conditions. Maybe we'll get to speak about this a little bit. I think James might want to add something on golf as well, sort of PGA Live Golf, if I understood correctly. Maybe a little bit also, again, coming back to NEOM and engagement with businesses, because ultimately I think the idea is really to try and find avenues of accountability that we can do. In this context, we're working with business stakeholders, but we're also working with organizers of mega sporting events or other events such as the Expo 2030. So what can these stakeholders do? What do we expect from them? what actions can we take to ensure that human rights are respected. So over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I was just going to sort of, I guess, reflect a little bit on when we look at PIF doing overall, and where does the human rights aspect sort of sit within that? I mean, I guess the first thing, you know, my understanding, and I'm not an expert on sovereign wealth funds, but what I understand from kind of taking a look at it in various ways over the past few years is, you know, the public investment fund was initially quite a conservative, low-key kind of sovereign wealth fund compared to others around the world, set up in the 70s. But I guess like a lot of things under Mohammed bin Salman, it's been transformed into being a much more radical agent than other sovereign wealth funds around the world. It's much more high risk. It is much less conservative and small b than most are. So if you look at, for example, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, the things that that fund invests in are quite boring, you know, and they're quite predictable. That's not the case with the Saudi fund. The other funds, I think, a lot of sovereign wealth funds also they have rather cautious, you know, quite limited aims. They want to kind of, you know, provide pensions for, you know, growing populations, or you know, they want to support certain kinds of industries within the country. The Saudi sovereign wealth fund, I think, again, what's striking about it is that it is, first, it's highly ambitious, attempting to grow very fast. It has this target of getting to a point of managing $2 trillion in assets by 2030. I understand that is unlikely, that it will manage to make that target. But that's a sense of the ambition. It also has this very expansive portfolio across multiple sectors. So it's tourism, it's hotels, it's power and desalination, it's physical retail. Again, this is relatively unusual to be quite so broad. And it's very opaque. You know, so there are these principles about sovereign wealth funds that are supposed to encourage transparency, the Santiago principles. There's obviously a range. Many sovereign wealth funds are very opaque, and Saudi Arabia is one of those. I guess when you're looking at what is it trying to do, you know, and again, this is my understanding, is that it seemingly fund is trying to do a number of things simultaneously. So domestically, there is obviously, you know, under 2030, the fund is trying to support diversification. So it's pumping money into Saudi firms in key sectors. What's interesting about, again, compared to other sovereign wealth funds, is that 80% of its investments are domestic. So that is, again, really distinct because, of course, for most sovereign wealth funds, the strategy is kind of based on you put your money outside so that you benefit, for example, from things like from assets outside. You're sort of hedging against problems you might have domestically. If you have problems domestically, then your assets out will raise in value. So you can then use those. So you're sort of saving for a rainy day, and obviously, particularly if your economy is based on oil, that's very helpful because you then, if you do, you could have a rainy day like 2014, as many countries did. So you know, one argument would be, and you see this when MBS was asked about Gulf. That's what he said the Gulf investment is about. Well, this is about building the sports sector. And I think it's really interesting, and it's a challenge, I think, for talking about this issue, you know, publicly, is I think most people do recognise that diversification of the Saudi economy is a good thing, right? That's what it needed, right? Is to move away from a dependence on oil. But the question is about how that's being done. Who's being prioritised for that investment? So we can sort of, I'll sort of come on to that a bit more. I think another sort of goal, so there's a sort of diversification aspect to this. There's also the strategic giga projects that you mentioned, so NEOM, but also Red Sea, the Red Sea project, Qadiyah, and so on. These obviously, you know, mega infrastructure projects, absolutely massive investments. They are not all supposed to be funded, as you mentioned, by the PIF. And part of the goal is supposed to get foreign investment in. So you provide a kind of vehicle that foreign direct investment could come in. The goal of the government is to pay $100 billion of foreign investment into the country every year. It's currently at 8 billion. So again, there's a long way to go. And part of the issue these projects see is extremely risky, you know, and exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, Sigurd. And not just politically risky, fraud risk, and incidents like the Ritz-Carlton hotel in 2017, where businesses and investors, business people and investors were sort of arrested and forced to hand their money over. These are the sort of things that make foreign investment into Saudi more difficult to attract. I think we also, have to acknowledge that a large, goal here is clearly, when you look at what the PIF is investing in, it's about projecting the Saudi brand, or the new Saudi brand, and influence. It's about changing the image of the country, and sport has obviously been the most clear example of that. And I think you see, I think that what's interesting there is the range of different sports. It's not just football, which has this mass global, commercial appeal. I think golf gets you to a different kind of audience. Golf gets you to the business community around the world. It gets you. It also gets you beyond elites into certain kind of middle classes in the United States, for example. And it's part of kind of normalizing Saudi Arabia as a potential investment destination or a potential to come and work. And I think the UAE was probably the first to do that. When you look at its sponsorship, Dubai World, DP World sponsoring the European PGA Tour, I think that played a big role in making Dubai a kind of a regional business hub. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that. I think we also look at, the PIF is also aiming to make Saudi a global player in certain sectors. Technology is a real, a lot of the really, alongside sport, a lot of the flashiest and most high-profile investments have been in tech. Some of those have been slightly disastrous, like the investment with SoftBank, which put a huge amount of backing for WeWork and other sort of slightly flop investments. But this is a really big investment. Lots of investment involving Israeli tech firms. So this is aiming to make Saudi a hub, because a lot of these investments will involve a kind of partnership aspect. So the idea will be, there's an investment in an overseas tech company, and then there needs to be part of that needs to be involve activity within Saudi Arabia. I think obviously when we look and you pointed to this, Ilya, the use of high tech equipment by the Saudi state is often directed against defenders. There's clearly a move towards mass surveillance, as we see with when we look at the planning for NEOM. So I think that's something we really have to take into account. I think, and I know that I think Abdullah will come on to this in his. I think there is a political aim, very direct political aim to PIF investments, to directly influence political actors overseas. So whether that be with, Jared Kushner perhaps being the most obvious answer, you buy yourself direct influence with actors in other states. And I don't want to talk too much about that because I know that's sort of coming up, some of those things. I think there's also, and I think along with that is that these investments, more indirectly, they provide a kind of buffer against ramifications for your actions. Why is it that, Saudi Arabia has never faced state-level sanctions for things like the war in Yemen, or it's for breaches of international humanitarian law in Yemen, or the murder of one of its own citizens in a foreign consulate, in one of its consulates overseas? Partly, I think this comes down to the fact that the presence of investments in foreign states, it is, I think, an important political buffer alongside, for example, arms sales and arms purchases. So I think I wanted to say that I think these sort of diverse range of activities, it makes it quite difficult to sort of grip, I think, for outside actors, like what is going on here? What is the strategy? What is benign and what is not benign? Because I think when you look at the range of investments domestically that the PIF's making, a lot of it is just frankly quite boring. You're looking at it, okay, there's some sort of cement company. This looks like relatively benign financial activity, but there is an awful lot else going on. I think you've got to look at some of the projects, and particularly the giga projects. The giga projects like NEOM, Live Golf. I mean, these are, these are very closely associated with the Crown Prince. They're designed to his authority, they promote his personal vision. And I think, you know, obviously you see that the PIF actually effectively took part in the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi through the ownership of the planes that took the assassins to Turkey. I think investment is in tech is a huge concern, as I mentioned. I think, you know, when we're looking at the domestic side, and I think there are other members who are more expert than me, but I think there is an argument that what is happening is, while, you know, in principle, diversification is something that should be supported, there is also an aspect that this is a sort of further consolidation of the centralized state power. It's bringing the private sector under the control of the centre, and it's creating sort of preferred companies to deliver this diversification project. I understand that some, you know, being a PIF supported project is likely to give you better access to then get contracts to deliver the kind of 2030 program. So how, like, just I don't want to talk for too long. So just a couple of thoughts on how different actors might engage the PIF or think about it from a kind of human rights perspective. It's obviously a question for us, you know, in civil society, but I think also wanted to look a little bit at business and foreign governments. I think when we look at businesses, and you mentioned, Julia, that, you know, you get a lot of inquiries on this from companies. I sometimes talk to companies about these things too. I think that one of the challenges we have is that the kind of prevailing framework to consider these issues is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It's a very important tool. It's a very important framework. However, it's a little limiting, I think, for thinking about PIF investments. If a business is being asked, you know, to take part in a PIF project, if you look at it through the Ruggie Principles, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also known as Ruggie Principles, the good thing you're considering is, will my business's involvement in this project directly or through my business partner lead to a human rights violation? So you have to be able to, it's a pretty tight test, actually. You have to be able to sort of directly see that, yes, you know, so it may apply, for example, if a company was being asked to do construction on NEOM, the migrant worker rights risk would be relatively clear, potentially, if they were quite close to the workers, if they had some supervisory role. But there are, I mean, we're talking about, as you say, a multi-billion-dollar project. There's an enormous amount of business activity involved in NEOM, where people could very easily, they could be making enormous amounts of money and very straightforwardly say, well, I'm not very close to any violations. I wouldn't have any influence over those. I wouldn't be directly benefiting from the exploitation of workers, but I'm being a consultant to the financial management aspect of this. So I do think there are, so I think we're failing to capture perhaps in that framework the question of contribution to projects and activities that essentially strengthen and bolster the sort of repressive architecture of the state. And I think that is a test that should be applied. I mean, I think it comes up quite a lot in authoritarian states. When you look, for example, at, you know, European support to European engagement with the Egyptian state, for example, I think that nobody's looking at the fact that they often sort of do a human rights impact assessment of activity with the army, but they won't consider, well, actually, does the simple fact of having this project lend legitimacy, support the project of the military state that's so repressive? And I think something similar needs to be, a test needs to be in place, which is, are we, by involving ourselves in this human rights horror show at NEOM, for example, are we in fact bolstering the kind of domestic and international legitimacy of MBS? So I think there is there's a question of values here, and I think that's very difficult to apply for businesses. I think the way we have to also, when we talk to business, we have to encourage them to think about reputational damage. I think reputational damage, what does it come down to? It comes down to when business has a set of values that it claims to espouse, it falls short of those in a big way, in a big contradictory way. It's why it's much more companies that have very strong positive brand values, they are more susceptible to reputational risk because it's quite difficult to get an arms company on reputational risk. You have to look for other things. So I think talking to businesses about the fact that by participating in these projects, which are really bolstering the authority of a dictator, they are tying themselves to that dictator in perpetuity. And that's a real hard material consideration they need to make and that their investors need to be aware of. The final little point I wanted to make was, there is, when we look at sovereign wealth fund activities overseas, there are growing concerns about, in some jurisdictions, about whether this is potentially a national security risk. These are businesses investing in your economy which have political aims. These are not simply. I mean, I guess the Newcastle investment is a very clear example of that. I don't think anybody seriously considers that the PIF is trying to make a return out of its purchase of Newcastle. And there are other sectors of the economy where that will be true as well. So there are calls in some quarters to do more to regulate sovereign wealth funds, to consider them as a distinct form of investment. One has to be very cautious about that because well, at the moment, by the way, the direction of travel is the opposite, right? So most states, they desperately want to entice in sovereign wealth funds for this kind of supply of, in quotes, easy money. So they offer tax breaks and they offer all sorts of kind of different programs to facilitate that investment. I think we have to be careful about how we talk about these things because you can play into a sort of anti-foreigner sentiment. But I do think, probably needs to be a harder look more broadly at, the degree to which, money at this scale, which can be very distorting, which can have a political influence. I think, if we're going to, I think especially the opacity about aims and objectives, these are things that policymakers need to consider very carefully.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James, and also for kind of raising questions beyond sort of what the UN guiding principles provide, and talking about not just whitewashing, but the consequences of those investments abroad, buying soft power, but buying influence that hinders accountability to a certain extent, and that will only be growing, and that's definitely something to consider for these investments abroad as well. I'm very conscious of time. We're running already a little bit late, so I think I would hand it over to Oda, who I know has also been working on a report on the PIF that will, I guess, be published soon. He might be able to tell more about this. And I think you might want to dive a little bit deeper into, PIF's involvement in criminal activity. But do correct me and feel free to talk about the elements in the report that you'd like to highlight here. And then we'll hopefully allow for 5 minutes question and answers, because I assume that the audience might have some questions also. Abdallah.
Thank you so much, Julia. Do you guys hear me okay? Do you guys hear me? Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm glad to be part of ALQST annual conference. I'm glad I heard from my colleagues here. I think the idea here is that, I'm gonna pick from where, for example, John talked about the Newcastle. It's a good segue to what I'm going to talk about. Because part of the Newcastle agreement with the Saudi government, with the actually PIF, the Public Investment Fund, is assurances that the Saudi government gave to the Newcastle, actually the Premier League, saying that the Newcastle ownership, the PIF's ownership in the Newcastle is not going to be controlled directly by the Saudi government. And for me, this was ridiculous for so many reasons. One, and the most important reason, is the structure of PIF, because PIF legally, according to the Public Investment Fund regulation and law in Saudi Arabia, is actually established and founded by a royal decree. The head of the public investment fund is no other than the crown prince himself, Mohammed bin Salman. The third is PIF itself cannot be dissolved unless by a royal decree. The whole makeup of PIF itself and every big decision regarding investment of PIF goes to the Mohammed bin Salman himself. And Yasser Al-Mayyan said that in one of the interviews that was actually aired in a Saudi national TV, where he said that there was a time when they actually wanted to not invest during the COVID because of the risk involved, and Mohammed bin Salman circumvented that and got a royal order or from the king to invest in I think it was the investment of the Royal Caribbean cruises at that time, because it was too risky. And by the way, it proved to be a wrong decision all along. Anyway, so the whole structure is Saudi government. It's never been an independent entity where you can treat as an investment vehicle that can be independent from the government and it's for the public. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, when you say the public, you mean the government. When you say the government, it's only one person. It's not even the top 10% or 1%. It's like 1%. It's one person who is Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince himself. And going to the criminal activities, yes, they have been involved in so many violations, including Neum, as Celsia said. Also, James talked about the involvement in the Khashoggi murder. Yes, this is one of the big criminal activities. The Prime Aviation, it's a one subsidy of PIF that was actually taken over by the Saudi government and given to PIF it actually during the October 4th anti-corruption purge that was billed as anti-corruption purge at that time. So when they took over the Prime Aviation, they used 2 private jets of that company to fly the team who killed and dismembered the famous journalist, our friend Jamal Khashoggi, at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd. And this was not the first and not the last, criminal activity that PIF has been involved in. Since October 4th in 2017, the Saudi government, and there are so many reports and documents that I myself have seen, showed that the Saudi government actually illegally confiscated money and put it in PIF's accounts. The head of PIF, Yasser Al-Mayyan, was involved in illegal shake-up and transfer of ownership of companies from people who some of them actually happened to be outside, and one of them happened to be in the UK, and their signature was actually missing in the document that actually transferred their ownership of their own company to PIF. So the whole makeup of PIF and its money and its ownership of many things has been illegal all along. So this is the other point I want to make. The third point is to say that, yes, PIF has been involved in sports watching, has been involved in these criminal activities, have been involved in the October 4th violations that included torture and electrocution, but also has been involved directly in trying to influence politics in the international stage, in the world. And I'll give a quick example that James kind of alluded to, which is the example of Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner has been given $2 billion and was put in a newly established firm that is not known to be an investment firm. And Steve Mnuchin, who happened also to be part of the Trump team, was also given a similar amount, like $2 billion in a similar structure and environment. So you can see, and all of that happened just before the midterm election in the U.S. And where at that time, Mohammed bin Salman actually also increased the oil prices in order to embarrass the Biden administration at that time, and try to affect the election. So it's part now. It's part of an investigation in Congress, and the Blumenthal committee about like whether the PGA, for example, tour that is now tend to be owned, the majority of ownership by PIF, is to affect the local politics here in the U.S., to affect the U.S. Generally. And for me, it's really amazing to see how, for example, the U.S. and the U.K. Didn't take seriously how this same government had actually showed multiple times that it actually does not respect borders or sovereignty of other states, that can use its own consulate in other countries, that can try to assassinate Iyad al-Baghdadi in Norway or al-Jabri in Canada, and showed that it can actually use its own legal system, its own methods to confiscate money illegally, even transfer ownership of companies for people who live like in the UK and elsewhere. They still trust this government and think that they can change or reform or can be trustworthy, let alone trust in and believe in that these assurances by PIF, that PIF is going to be independent from the Saudi government and it's not going to be controlled by Mohammed bin Salman, who showed over and over and over that he does not respect international law or even sovereignty of other countries.
Thank you so much, Abdallah. Thanks to all of the speakers helping to shed light on the role of the PIF in whitewashing, sports washing, buying influence with business stakeholders and politicians all over the world, let alone the question of whether the investments are really in the best interest of the people. I know we're a bit late. Are there questions? I will be happy to take one or two quick questions. If there are none, then I'd also be happy to hand over to the moderator of the next session. Jerry, we will be moderating the next session, which will focus on the mobilization of Saudi activists in the diaspora. But thank you very much to all the speakers on this panel. Thank you.
Welcome everyone in this fourth session in our annual conference. First of all, let's all remember our brothers and sisters in Gaza who are suffering from the genocide committed by the occupation. And when we remember what's going in Palestine, we stand in solidarity. We're not just in solidarity, but we as Arabs are threatened also by this entity. And this entity is providing all of our governments with these spying systems. So we must face these governments and this entity, which is supporting them as we speak now, from the hunger which is caused in Gaza, the genocide. We can see that in the climate conference that the UAE government has signed an agreement with land transportation, which cannot happen without a Saudi approval, because this pathway should pass through the Saudi territories, which means that there is an approval by the Saudi government to use the Saudi territories for the land transportation to the occupied territories, while all the free people around the world refuse this entity and refuse to do any kind of cooperation with it due to its many brutal crimes. And as we speak on what's going on in Gaza, we should also speak about our people in Saudi Arabia who are facing this normalization of policy and all kinds of relationship with such an entity. And when we speak about resistance, we speak about Khalid al-Amer, al-Taibi, and a lot of other people of our nationals. But unfortunately, and lately, they didn't have the opportunity to express their opinion about the normalization. But we did hear the voices of our nationals from the diaspora, which is the concern the Saudi nationals and the diaspora, their activities, their actions, what they have done previously, their future hopes, and all the NGOs or the associations that they have founded in the diaspora. I welcome Mr. Yahya Siri and also Fawz Al-Taibi. Unfortunately, Umayma Anajari and Madawi Arashid were supposed to be with us in this session, but they had urgent situation which prevented them from participating in this session. Mr. First, when we speak about working in the diaspora, you are among the persons who founded associations or NGOs like ALQST organization. So when we speak about the national party, you were a major contributor despite the many difficulties. So what are your advices for the Saudi nationals and the diaspora? What are the available capabilities which they can make use of in the diaspora? Thank you, Abdullah, and thank you, ALQST, Julia, and all the team for organizing this beautiful webinar. And everyone who is listening to us, probably we did face a little bit of technical issues, but regardless of this, we have great participants, great speakers, and we are proud for ALQST organization for organizing such a webinar. So we thank them a lot. So as a brief introduction, why can't we speak today without remembering Palestine? As Julia, Abdullah, Lena has mentioned, we should say a word about Palestine and ask for freedom for Palestine, support its rights, the rights of its people, because we are in a human rights organization to criticize this regime which violates the rights of its own people. As we speak, we see the many violations committed by this entity against another people. So we shouldn't go past by it, ignoring it. We should remind them of the terror that they're being subject to, and despite our differences, it has nothing to do with the occupation, because we all agree that it's an occupation that commits all kinds of crimes. Probably we are criticizing here the Saudi regime, for their corruption, but to be very frank, we totally refuse any kind of occupation, any brutal dealing against any people. So it's a turning point in history, and it highlights who support the rights for real and who don't, support them only selectively. So a recent book or booklet was published about the activities that are being held in the diaspora. She wrote in her book a sum up about the great activities being held outside, and probably we came from a very regressive environment for any civil activities or civic activities, because it's almost absent, and it's really counterfeit in all aspects, not only in silencing them, but also criminalizing the civic activities. And the authorities, the current authorities, were able to take over the narrative and the judiciary system, because they control the society, all from the education phase to the Friday religious speech. So everything which you hear from speeches are done by the authorities. They are speaking on behalf of the authorities. We are habituated to hear about the struggles in the community between those who go and say public speeches, and between the newspapers. We can hear that there are different trends, different parties. This is added to the gender struggles, to the political, religious struggles. But there is a common factor between all of these struggles, because they all call to the obedience for the ruler. So if we see one of the prominent names, Saudi names, we were told that he is a liberal. He wrote a tweet which is very clear, and I really thank him for this tweet, because he said, I don't have any sanctity but two. So they criticized him because they thought that he was criticizing the prophet. First of all, he said, I have two sanctities, the freedom and the royalty. This reminds me that there is a big contradiction in the mentality which the authority holds. Also, the religious men, especially in the which the speech and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia platform in Mecca, they would say that I'm warning you about these social media platforms, because they found that there is a little bit of space of freedom where the community can actually express their opinions a little bit with freedom. And this religious man has mentioned this in a rhyming sentence to give it sort of a religious sanctity. So what I am referring to, that this narrative, and despite that they are referring them to different trends, are actually one narrative which goes back to the authority, which prohibited the people from accepting the others, from hearing the other people's opinion, accepting them, respecting them, dialogue, opening to others, hearing other people's opinions and discussing them about what's acceptable or not. So the authority's speech is that you should be all similar to each other. You hold the same mentality, the same form, and the same decisions. You should be all alike, matching versions. This was the strategy adopted by the authorities since years. Probably this is a joke for you. Probably this is a joke for you, but one of my friends reminded me that we have met after founding ALQST organization, and I recalled the interviews when ALQST organization was founded, and everyone was asking, why was it called as so? Probably it's bizarre right now, but actually back then it really called for it. I was in dire need to take a actual term from the Holy Quran to tell people we are not against religion, because human rights by these people are considered as if you are waging a war against Muslims and Islam. So some now realize the importance of having human rights organization. And in one of the days, I had a campaign with Amnesty International to save a woman who has killed the owner of the house. She was a housemaid, and she killed her employer. Of course, when we looked into the details, also this housemaid was killed after, and after looking into the details, there was a lot of injustice trial and many other details that I won't go through, but there was a campaign to stop the death penalty. So everyone was saying that, oh, you are fighting the religion and you want to stop the death penalty. But at the same time, there was a death penalty for one of the tribe's members, and they were funding campaigns to stop that. So back then, a prince has killed one, and they have executed one of his assistants instead. So if you call for stopping the death penalty, you are considered like you are against the religion. But if it's a prince, they would go contrary-wise. So I can't actually blame the community or the society without looking back into the causes, because if there was a freedom of expression, probably they would have heard the other people's opinions. After these years, we are asking for stopping or for halting the death penalties, and lately who used to criticize us also now support us in our demand, because they consider that these authorities do not express any kind of justice. They try to legitimize the judiciary system in Saudi Arabia, now realize the big, great mistake they have did. But I'm saying now, probably my friends outside Saudi Arabia don't know that we are suffering along with our community members because of the government control over the narrative. But we believe that with time and with the pressures exercised and with the opening to each other through the social media platforms, we have a brand new generation. So it's not a joke. why we named it ALQST, because the new generation doesn't have an issue with it. The new generation is more aware, is more capable of hearing other people's or other parties' opinions. They can analyze furthermore and acknowledge furthermore. And this is where we concentrate our efforts, probably after years of difficulties and challenges which ALQST has passed through different phases. And our dear friend and ALQST here with us can affirm that. So whoever knows us would think that probably this organization has come to an end, but after a while, ALQST had or was able to do a turning point, not only in the human rights awareness, and now we have a lot of other NGOs who are friends of us, activists, friends. It's not, or it's no longer a problematic in supporting the human rights. Now we have a lot of issues in founding this party because you have small numbers and there's no political awareness in Saudi Arabia, and this calls for elections, and there are a lot of buts and a lot of criticism, but we should do such actions. That's why I call here the activists, the Saudi activists, especially those in diaspora, that cursing or criticism is not the solution, and cursing the regime, this will not serve you. The institutional work and working with a human rights organization, with the media, like Lina, she is being awesome in this. This makes a change. So when the actions are institutional, when they are organized, this serves good in the language which all the world understands. Now, Mr. Jawad mentioned today and in the previous webinar, today in this phase, we are in front of a great earthquake in the human rights situation, especially within what's going on in Palestine. So shall we surrender now and say that everything is lies? We hear a lot that if there was good in the world, then this wouldn't have happened. However, is it our role to prove that we hold on to this choice and we really stand by the human being despite the circumstances, and we are pushing through this direction? So we must keep on going on despite the circumstances, despite the difficulties. We should go on honestly, frankly, transparently, because we're defending human rights, refusing the violence, refusing the tyranny. We should go on the same wave, and this transparency, we have all our efforts concentrated on this new generation. We shouldn't surrender. There are a lot of good people like us, those in the hall and the other friends who communicate with us or help or coordinate. And in the world, there are other people who have their own interests, stand with the tyrants. So where we stand, we should stand with the right, with the organized, solid actions which we know that will lead us to a result. We shouldn't just express our anger in statements or so. So this is what I'm calling for. I'm calling our youth. Second, I call my friends from outside our country to understand the difficulty of the situation, because it's completely complicated. I remember in the beginning, it was more difficult when we used to transfer any news that like a person was subject to torture. The media, the international media, would ask for independent resources, but I would tell them that I had a phone call from inside the prison. How would you want me to give you such a resource? So the criteria, which was a applied wasn't really suitable, but now they are more understanding. And now I'm asking whoever is working in the Saudi Arabia human rights arena to understand the situation, the difficulty, the complication of the situation in order to be able to get results. Lately, I think that the one-of-a-kind work did changes. All of your efforts is doing a change. And I hope that none of you would feel despair. We always say the prisoners are still in the prison, the torture is still going on, the death penalty is still going on. This is true, but if it wasn't for the generous and noble work that you're doing, that situation would have been much worse. This is our thoughts, because we have our colleagues Lajain Havloul and another one, you know what the regimes said about them when they were arrested and how the course of the lawsuit, and because of the pressures exercised, the situation is much better. They were subject to sexual harassment, to torture, to unjust trials. This is true. But within all of this, at least we can restrict to an extent this tyranny, and that's why I confirm that the institutional actions is very important. Cooperation among each other, accepting the differences among us, and trying to find a common ground. We should work on it to enforce the human rights, the freedom of expression, and acceptance of the other, not only in Saudi Arabia, but also everywhere in the Gulf states. And we have a lot of friends there, and also in the Arab world and in the whole world. This is what we need most. The scene is not or doesn't look great, but the work that you are doing, the efforts you are exercising, it's being a better place. Thank you so much, Abu Faris. So when we speak about the violations and the human rights inside Saudi Arabia, it's very important to highlight a case, Fozla Taibi. Probably its opportunity to not be in the prison. Probably no one can understand more why your Maryam is in prison and why you're not. Can you further explain the details about your case? The three sisters of Al-Taibi. Of course, it's because of our activity in women rights. Before 4 years, when there was a male custody, most of the women in Saudi Arabia were active in this issue. And after a while, I traveled, and they persecuted all the activists. And after 4 years, when I came back to Saudi Arabia for a visit, and by coincidence, we were all there, my sister, Maryam, has a travel ban, and Manal was arrested because she accompanied me. I was the main target, and I believe that the government is afraid that this would go public. So it was afraid that I would speak about the travel ban of Maryam, because they promised me that if I don't speak out, and that they will set Maryam free. And as any woman, I trust the regime, and I stand with my country, and of course I demand my rights, but I don't have any political goals. And I didn't expect that even our rights, that the our state would look at like that they would exploit any opportunity to arrest us. So when we were forced together, they issued a decision to arrest me. Maryam has a travel ban, and she can speak about that. What happened, actually, I managed to travel since 4 years. We don't have any common ground. Manahil is there. I traveled to Bahrain. They halted any services, but I still trust the judiciary system. I didn't think it was as bad as it was. I sent a lot of telegraph, a lot of letters, but then I found out that it's a very dangerous situation, and probably I would have been detained for long years. But I didn't really think that I was actually persecuted, that I would be arrested the moment I go to Saudi Arabia. I was really shocked because whenever Manahel's detaining period would get longer, I would be surprised at what's going on. I thought that my country would listen to their own people. I would ask them, help me. It's my own right. And I stated the details as they are, but you know that we cannot criticize any of the governmental institutions, but no one responded to me. But the fake accounts on the social media attacked me, and they said that we are torturing Manahel, threatening me to kill me. So I had to go and do an attitude at the same point where I was requesting for my own rights. The government employees should hear my complaints. That was supposed to be their task. However, ALQST organization was the only one who heard my complaint and to take our own rights but the government decided to ignore hearing my complaint. Right now, I'm a refugee in another country. I never thought that in a period where they are boasting about enforcing or empowering women, I thought I would be an activist in the women's rights, because I express my own voice. So I'm a woman and I should express that. Who would be better than me representing that? A man or who? They didn't approve that we keep on the activism, and Manahel the same case. And even though that we let go of our activism, the government would exploit any opportunity that no one, if they would do an assassination of character, and then they would try to trap you in another situation. And I was subject to a lot of bad situations. A lot of people tried to drag me into charging me with crimes. And of course, I would have refused that. And I never knew that they were apparatus related to the government. They tried to fool me. They tried to lure me around. I hardly was able to set myself free. And when they have issued an arresting decision against me, I knew that they didn't have any other excuses before the public. And then they said for my activism, for the women's rights activism, which shouldn't be criminalized by law. And what happened later on? Since that day, Manahel is still detained. We don't have any kind of communication with her. The last time you knew any news about her, that she was subject to torture, and she's not allowed to speak with us, because she's not allowed even to tell us what is going on with her. So just imagine that Manahel, who used to defend the vision and the changes, that's what happened to her. So anyone who would have any confrontation with the government would be in a very difficult situation. So if the government didn't respect their desire, the situation is very difficult, and more difficult even before the changes which they claimed happening for the woman. And also, as for my sister Mariam, she doesn't have any crimes charged with, but however, she's still having a travel ban since 5 years. And ironically, when she was asking the ruler in Saudi Arabia that I have a travel ban. I sent letters, I got referrals without having any confrontations. They do not accept the fact that we even asks for demands. And then a decision was issued against her for imprisonment 4 months before she claimed publicly for her rights. So how could we demand our rights if not publicly, if not through letters, if not even begging? But we shouldn't be begging that. We should speak very frankly, very loudly what happened with us. We should criticize any institution, however they won't accept that, or the attorney that you're subject to. And they will tell everyone that the situation has changed and everything is okay. And they don't want any of these narratives to actually be discovered by anyone. They have harassed my whole family, and especially that I became more famous, and they were afraid that I would speak one day about the tyranny that my sisters were subject to. So as for Manahil, what are your fears concerning her, especially that you don't have any specific information about her with the lack of communication? What are your expectations? What is the reason behind that? Is the administration of the prison preventing her from communicating? My concern for Manahil, they are manipulating her psychology. She would being set free with the psychological issues. So if someone doesn't commit a crime and was detained or imprisoned, they would be in a very difficult psychological situation. I think they won't benefit anything from the detaining of Manahil. And they have exploited the opportunity that she was with me 4 years ago to imprison her. There's another question. At one point, you were outside Saudi Arabia and now in diaspora. What's your motive in remaining in diaspora? Why won't you go back to Saudi Arabia? What are the reasons that if they happened, you would say, I feel safe to go back to Saudi Arabia? I didn't find a nation or a country to protect me. I didn't find anyone to provide me with protection. I think that any national has the right to be protection. I'm not speaking about extremism, terrorism. I'm speaking about the government men who are being extremist against us when we demand our rights. I think I'm a survivor compared to my sister. If the Saudi Arabia was a safe environment, safe for women, why Manahila is still detained? She used to practice sports. Why is she still in prison? Why those who sought the West countries, I can be more free to express and talk? I think after Manahil, you would listen to a lot of similar stories. So in the story of Manahil, or in the case of Manahil, the government has no benefits whatsoever. On the contrary, it damages its image. Thank you so much, Fos. As you have mentioned, you are a survivor, and unfortunately, there are a lot of similar stories for women and didn't have the opportunity as you did. Although a diaspora isn't actually a luxury, but it's a problematic. But being in prison is more problematic, and I hope you and your other sisters will remain safe. Right now, we are at the end of this session. Does anyone have any other questions before we conclude? So if the focus was about the Gulf activists in the diaspora and how to coordinate between each other to provide a national program, then they can provide an alternative for what's occurring from marginalizing the nationals and not having actual just judiciary institutions. Unfortunately, probably the awareness isn't really complete for these activists in the diaspora. It's actually a golden opportunity because you have more freedom than you have in your own countries. I can earn a lot of expertise from those who preceded you in the organizational and institutional actions and looking for new projects, and you can have a bigger margin in advertising or marketing your own projects because you have a lot of human rights committees or associations, NGOs supporting you. And I think if we missed such an opportunity and then we didn't organize our actions correct-wise, then we will weaken the motivation for any future generation to claim back their rights. That's why I think there is a delinquency, unfortunately, and an awareness that we can provide a lot for this through the environment we're living or the community we're living in right now. We can't ignore that there are some organizations or parties who are related to governmental authorities who try to separate us and to try to keep us separated due to our ethnicities or our religions, or that you have certain questioned relationships with some parties. These are concerns, but the truth is we have a common ground, we share common concerns, and we agree on most of the things. We have a similar directions of the struggles, of the challenges, and we have solutions that we can provide all together within this diversification while respecting the human rights values, human values within a civil state and turning of authority. Of course, we can have different opinions. However, at the end, we agree more than we differ. So how did this Gulf states within this difference of systems, how did they agree altogether, and we, the victims, that we didn't agree as they did, although we had a lot more of common ground? Thank you so much, Dr. Jawad, for your words. Thank you so much, Dr. Jawad. And as you have mentioned, all of these regimes, they have rooting problems. However, in the security coordination, they ignore any kind of differences. They neglect them and they work all together. And this reminds us with what Abdurrahman said, that we should all work together in one collective project. So the common ground that we have is greater than the differences. And the first rule that we should work upon is the human rights. And I would tell because you're one of the prominent human rights activists, so such a meeting or a union should happen. And I call here for Abdullah, Democratic Diwan, which has a great administration team, and they are now in London and outside. So I think that they should do workshops for this to have a collective action as Mr. Jawad has mentioned, and I call for the same. And not only in the Gulf states, Arab activists, we can find a common ground to a common umbrella to work underneath. We can have our independent associations or organizations, or probably we can come to a new coalition or union. So probably we can imitate here the regimes that when they feel at risk, they would unite all together. Probably we can unite to counterfight this brutality and tyranny. Now this is a new responsibility. So do you have any more questions? Thank you so much for this invitation. My thoughts go with you, Foz, and with all your family members and prisoners. And Yahya has mentioned also other cases. I think that the regimes right now are coming all together. And the idea which bothers them is the union or the coalition of the activists who claim for freedom. They should come over the differences. So one of the things which happened in the Arab Spring, that the people have forgotten the problems they have within each other and the differences. They were able to unite at a time, probably a limited time, probably afterwards when they went back to their old habits, then it failed. So the prisoners in Egypt, it should be the cause in Saudi Arabia, and the prisoners in Saudi Arabia, it should also be a cause for those in Egypt and vice versa. So one people would consider that the claims for freedom are mutual. I think that this would exercise pressure against the regime. Thank you, Mr. Abdurrahman. Can you have an additional final remark? Mr. Abdurrahman mentioned that in the Arab regime or in the Arab Spring, there was a common language. It's because of the action, because people saw a glimpse of hope, so they worked towards that. But after the failure which happened, everyone went back to their own habits, cursing each other, to an extent that one of my very close friends is one of the callers for reforming. He wrote an article where he criticized everyone, including me, and he took an attitude against me that because I was against the war in Yemen, and until today he is with. So I think that what's going and reflects what he mentioned in the article, because when people feel despair, they would go back. So after the tyranny that happened in the Arab Spring, everyone would go back to their own bases. Oh, this is a Shia, this is a Sunni. So I think that what enforces the morals, the cooperation, and the despair took back the people to their old bad habits. Good evening, everyone, and I thank you for your participation in this conference, and I hope we can get back together in future events. Good evening.